Hi, I'm Laura Eit. I'm the director and main author of Latin Through Stories, and I wanted to give you a quick introduction to Level 2. I'm going to start with something that is not specific to Level 2, but that will give you a bigger picture view of why the curriculum is designed the way it is. So we'll talk a little bit about the Trivium, which has been the foundation and the way Latin has been studied throughout the centuries. And then we'll go into more detail about individual curriculum elements and some teaching tips about those. So let's get started with the Trivium. And in my application of the Trivium to language study, I draw heavily on Clark and Jane's book on the liberal arts tradition, which I highly recommend. It's not specific to language teaching, of course, but the chapter on the Trivium is, I think, very applicable to second language acquisition and language teaching in general. They discuss very concretely what each part of the Trivium might look like for various ages and levels. And they discuss the art of grammar as imitative practice through which students become attuned to language and learn to be at home in language. So this is not imitation as in like mindless repeat after me type repetition. Becoming attuned to language and learning to be at home in language means that we create a mental representation of the structures of that language. And we help students do that by exposing them to the language extensively and in, of course, age-appropriate ways. So what might this look like in the classroom? So for the earliest levels, Clark and Jane suggest things like engaging students in dialogue, reciting various songs and reading them stories. And that's really what all of the elements in Latin Through Stories attempt to do. And I want to especially emphasize here extensive memorization and copious oral and interactive reading aloud. And just as a reminder, something that we've repeatedly said with regard to Level 1, so it's really important to keep reviewing what students have memorized. Language that you memorize and then forget is really not useful for language acquisition. It doesn't become acquired language. It's also really helpful to do this orally, especially with young children, so that no one feels put on the spot, that it's just a whole class activity, everyone is engaged that way. And for the teacher to continue to speak along so that you can model expressive recitation, expressive reading, and ideally also good pronunciation, at least pronouncing the endings clearly so that differences between various word forms become clear. And that will help focus on increasing students' fluency and accuracy, ideally. We're increasing both all the time. So all of these elements provide rich linguistic input, and input is widely recognized among second language acquisition researchers as the sine qua non of language acquisition. According to the research, acquisition happens when students receive extensive exposure to meaningful and comprehensible language in complete sentences. So those three elements are really crucial: comprehensible, meaningful, and extensive. So good input is language that is just a little bit above students' current level so that it's fully comprehensible, and that conveys interesting content, and that is available abundantly. So we really want to try and fill the class period as much as possible with Latin and expose students to the language as much as possible in each class period. So that will help create, in Andrew Kudowa's words, reliably correct language patterns in their brains. And I think he really nails it when he says in so many of his talks that you can't get out of a brain what isn't in there to begin with. That is really the whole idea of input. If you haven't listened to his talk, Nurturing Competent Communicators, I strongly recommend it. Again, not something specific to language teaching, but highly applicable. It's free on the IEW website. So input is the foundation for language acquisition, but interacting with and in the language is also crucial. So that brings me to the second art of the Trivium, the art of dialectic. And as Clark and Jane say, dialogue or conversation is the key pedagogy in this Trivium art. And In Latin through stories, we cultivate this, for example, in the Little Socratic Talks and in the Little Socratic Readings, the interactive reading. And I mention reading as both part of the art of grammar and the art of dialectic because reading is really at the heart of our classical education and has always been seen as foundational for language acquisition. The importance of asking good questions and engaging students in dialogue has been amply confirmed by both history and current research in second language acquisition. And according to the research, interaction is important for at least two reasons. One, it helps learners focus their attention on and process the new vocabulary or grammar forms that they're hearing or reading. And secondly, research also makes clear that active involvement with the language is by far more effective in fostering long-term retention of vocabulary and forms. So when students actively use vocabulary and grammatical forms in meaningful, compelling interactions with others, those forms become much more firmly ingrained in their internal lexicon or grammar than if they're just exposed to them. And finally, we come to the art of rhetoric. And Clark and Jane define this as the art of making creative, persuasive, and productive use of language in public speech. And I would add in writing too, because writing has been throughout the centuries really both method and goal for Latin education. And although our beginning and intermediate level students are really more in a pre-rhetoric stage, I think it's really important to lay a strong foundation for rhetoric from the beginning. So here are some of the pre-oratory type exercises students could do. And I've already mentioned poetry, recitation, and oral interaction with story, including retelling. Reader's theater is another excellent artist training device because it trains them in fluent and expressive delivery while also allowing them to further assimilate vocabulary and grammatical structures. And here are some examples of what we might call pre-rhetoric, so writing practice that is included throughout Latin through stories sprinkled here and there. So here's just an overview of the three trivium arts, and I've split this up here in K through third grade and then fourth and fifth. I'll be talking about that in a minute, because I think there's quite a difference between a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old. And of course, in the early grades, the arts of grammar and dialectic will be much more important than the art of rhetoric or even pre-rhetoric. But I think it is still beneficial for us to keep the entire trivium in mind in very general and basic terms. We can think of the art of grammar as being mostly about input, linguistic input. The art of dialectic as being about input along with guided output, and then the art of rhetoric or pre-rhetoric as the beginning of creative and expressive student output. So a focus on the trivium helps us keep in mind that language acquisition requires the foundation of language as input. Students need to be exposed to the language in complete sentences extensively, but they also need the interaction and the output eventually. And especially in the early grades, students are going to be much better served by using and hearing, for example, verb conjugations, than by chanting or drilling them. As Clark and Jane emphasize, the first goal of a grammar education is to train students' memory through imitation and to gain an intuitive command of forms. But once students have progressed in the arts of grammar and dialectic, we can certainly also expect them to look at language and to gain an understanding of how language works. So this is where the grammar practice and the quick little grammar drills come in for the later elementary grades to help students also gain an awareness of how language itself works. And I've included grammar here, some explicit grammar exercises here under dialectic and logic as well, because analytical grammar really is a highly logical activity. When you dissect language, when you analyze it, that's really an aspect of logic. And it's also dialectical in that you have to ask yourself questions, you have to ask the right questions. To figure out what the subject is, you have to ask yourself who or what is doing the action here. And then you have to know what question to ask to identify the direct object or the indirect object in a sentence. So let's move on to just a brief general overview of Level 2. So Level 2 is about the year, going through the seasons of a year in Latin. And we begin Theme 1 with summer as well as fall, because usually when school starts, there's still some sort of summer month left. And then we move into fall. So Theme 1 is summer and fall, with some optional lessons on Thanksgiving. So if you have some extra time around Thanksgiving, this would be some extra lessons that you can do. And then ideally after Thanksgiving, you would start with Theme 2 on winter. And that also includes some optional Christmas and Epiphany series and new Christmas songs that you can integrate. And then we come into spring and also end again with summer, so that we kind of have summer at the beginning and also at the end. And the spring month also include, again, optional grand series on Easter and the Last Supper, if you want to integrate those. And just a quick note here on grand series, you are always welcome to simplify any if you feel like they are too complex, too complicated. You could just leave out some sentences. An example here would be, maybe we skip putting on the bathing suit, and you could even definitely leave out the last sentence here too. So if you feel like you want to simplify things, as long as you still have a meaningful logical sequence, that is perfectly fine. Here are the stories from Level 1 that are briefly reviewed in Level 2. So as you can see, they're all really just used once or twice, just to review all of that vocabulary and those grammar structures. And you can certainly use others than the ones listed here. If there was a favorite that you would like to review, then by all means use that. But the important thing is that you do review a good number of Level 1 stories, so that students are not thrown into all new stuff right away. And then the new Level 2 stories still continue with the theme of folktales for the most part. The Year at Maple Hill Farm is a book that we use throughout. It has a big page of really mostly pictures for each month of the year, and then we have guided, basically similar to picture studies, guided conversations for you about those pictures and ignoring the English text on there. So that is used throughout the year for each month. And then the others are mostly folktales, except for the very last one. I'll talk about that in a minute. And as you can see here, again, this is just the review structure. So just again, as a reminder that it's really important to reread. The point is not to just read once and comprehend, but to really assimilate, internalize the language. And that's why it's also ideal to get to the point where students can do the reader's theater, which they can do if they've heard it multiple times before. So here are the two books that you need to purchase separately. So the Year at Maple Hill Farm is the one that I just talked about. And then How Will We Get to the Beach is one for which we have a Latin translation that you have to cut out and print and cut out and put over the English text. This is a really cute story that works really well at the end of the school year about going to the beach. So I think it's a nice end of the school year type reading. We'll have a live webinar to introduce you and practice some of these elements together. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, or really at any point in the school year, if you have any questions, please ask. Please feel free to email me or post on our Facebook group.